And the committee had passed H401. We'd done a little work and amended it. The House approved it, sent it to the Senate. In the Senate, it went to the Health and Welfare Committee. So Senator Gulick is joining us this morning to share a little bit about what happened in the Senate. And the bill, by the way, it passed the Senate yesterday, I think. So it'll be on our way back to us. We'll hear about it. And we're going to take some testimony today. So good morning and welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for having me, Chair and Agriculture Committee, House Ag Committee. My name is Martine Larock-Ulick, and I am a senator from the Chittenden Central District. I am Vice Chair of Senate Health and Welfare, and we were really excited to take up this bill for H401 as it came over from the House. We looked at it briefly and then added quite a bit to it, and Katie McGlynn will go through the details. But the health department had some additions that they wanted to place on the bill. We had some great testimony from one of the co-sponsors of the bill who came in and spoke with us, as well as we heard from rural Vermont. We heard from some farms, again, the Department of Health, and ultimately ended up voting it out of our committee 4-1-0. On the Senate floor, we had some robust discussions. It was very interesting and entertaining. And ultimately, yesterday on third reading, we passed it unanimously out of the Senate. So that was really exciting. You will see as Katie goes through the bill with you that there's some added language, some new definitions. One of them, which is fairly key to this new version of the bill, is cottage food operation. And there are a bunch of definitions under what a cottage food product is. And as we heard from the folks who sponsored the bill, this is really about increasing the threshold that is required for certification. So it's really supposed to kind of make things easier and help folks make a little either extra living or possibly just a living from selling these products. So we were excited to be in support of that. Let's see, what else did I want to talk about today? I think that was the bulk of it. In finance, we passed it out 7-0 because the fee differential is not, although it wasn't de minimis, it was marginal. So we didn't see that as any kind of a roadblock. So
Directionally, is it going to increase or decrease fees ultimately?
It will ultimately decrease fees, but again, not by much. I do have a fiscal note if you would all be interested in seeing it.
I think we can, thank you for making us aware of that. And we can have JFO, I think, come in if we have questions about that. The council might be able to address them too.
Yeah, there's a real nice short 1.5 page fiscal note that could be helpful to you all when you're looking at this.
You mentioned a robust discussion on the Senate floor. Any particular concerns that came up that ultimately were apparently allayed?
Yeah, so a couple of questions that I received as a reporter of the bill. One was just, if you are a farmer and you're selling raw vegetables and you're also selling those same vegetables as a pickled product, will those raw vegetables count toward that $30,000 of sales of the pickled or jarred item? The answer from the health department was no. Those are considered like two separate products. So the raw vegetable sales does not count as part of the canned or pickled sales. That was one. The other one was about if you've got a family recipe, is it the practice of the health department to share that kind of coveted recipe that you got from your great grandmother? And they responded, absolutely not. It's not their practice to share those recipes. So those were just a couple of the questions that came up.
So Colonel Sanders, a secret recipe is safe for Bush's baked beans? No.
I believe so. Yes, you can ask further questions of the health department, but yes, that was the gist of their response was they do not share that information.
Representative Bosland?
Yeah, can you just highlight a little bit what you changed from what we sent over to you?
I will let Katie go through that, but
Okay.
basically we added cottage food. We had a bunch of definitions. And again, the threshold, well, that was really something that you had done, but we upheld that in here. There's a section on exemptions, and then of course, there's some language around making sure that the pickling process is safe. So there's a part about pH and about or using a recipe from the Center for Home Food Preservation. There's a processing authority, and I'll let the folks who are experts.
So does that mean like is lacto fermented sauerkraut that hasn't been in a water bath, is that approved or not approved? Because if you do a water bath, you kill the probiotics in the lacto fermented product. So in terms of pickling or fermentation,
I am
wondering
not
about
an
that.
expert on
Okay.
fermentation, but the language in, as you can, you guys have a copy of the bill? On page 3, M, which is one of the definitions of
Yeah.
cottage food product, it says home canned pickles, vegetables, or fruits having an equilibrium pH value of 4.6 or lower, or a water activity value of 0.85 or less that are made using recipes. And then it goes on to talk about how you get those approved recipes. We did have a lot of conversation in our committee about like, what is our role as a health and welfare committee? We're not economic development, we're not ag. So we were really looking at the health and safety of the products. And we wanted to make sure that everything that was approved in the bill was safe for consumption. Very important.
Other questions for the reporter of the bill? Senator Gillick, thank you. Oh, Representative Lipsky.
Yeah, you talked about proprietary recipes, but what about ingredients? Which are different than a recipe? Is there any, if there's salt?
labeling requires you.
I don't feel confident answering that question, so I'll let the health department respond to that, or maybe Katie, sorry, yeah, but I don't.
You know, and I'm thinking, or peanuts, if there's someone might have an allergy to something.
So you're talking about labeling.
Like,
Okay, I will let,
That's sort of outside of the scope of this particular bill, but the health department is here, so I'm guessing I could answer what their labeling requirements are.
When we get to the health department, we can dig into that a little bit. Yeah. All right, thank you. I know you've got
thank you. Yeah,
going on upstairs, so.
bills that we're working on, but yeah, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it,
coming
and
upstairs.
best of luck. You bet. I've never been in this room before, so.
Well, you're welcome anytime.
Is the bill on our page, David?
So we're gonna get it on our page, yeah, and we're also getting printed copies, so.
Okay, oh, great, because I'm just trying to find it. I'm not finding the current version.
Good morning.
When, do you want to, we're gonna get printed copies, Katie, so if you want to put it up on the screen,
Sure.
you can.
Bill, that was some pretty ninja talk on that lactobacillus.
I'm a fermenter man, but I don't measure my stuff in 4-H, so I'll have to ask some more questions to the next candidate.
Okay.
So I think if everybody's okay with going ahead and get started, we've got it up on the screen and we'll have it available in a minute in printed form too.
Okay, so Katie McGlynn, Office of Legislative Counsel. This is H401 as it has come back from the Senate. Just to refresh your memory about what this bill is about. This is about when a home producer can qualify to not have to get a license or pay the licensure fee. So this is when they qualify for an exemption from a license and licensure fee. When the bill left this committee, there were 2 categories of food, non-bakery products and the bakery products, and you created an exemption if those items were produced at home and the producer was earning under $30,000 a year, then they would have an exemption from license and licensure fees. This version, has evolved a bit. There is a conversation with the health department about what other states were doing in our region in this area. And other states in the region and across the country have a separate category, a cottage food product category. So that is what you'll see in this draft, that there is a new category of home food production that has been created. That category also has the same exemption that this committee set of $30,000 or less. There's no license or licensure fee. And many of the products that would have been covered under your exemption would be covered under the exemption provided in the bill, but it's the categories don't exactly overlap. They're a little bit distinct. So Section 1, legislative intent. This is your language. The Senate did not change it. So I'm going to just scroll past that for the moment. As I said, there's a new category created, this cottage food product category. And so the definitions in Title 18, the health title that governs food and lodging establishments, has been amended to contain these new definitions. So first, we have a cottage food operation. That means a food manufacturing establishment where a cottage food product is produced. Second, we have the cottage food operator. Means a person who produces or packages a cottage food products. Means a person who produces or packages cottage food products solely in the home kitchen of the person's private residential dwelling or a kitchen on the person's personal property. And then 6, cottage food product means a food sold by a cottage food operator that does not require refrigeration or time or temperature control for safety. And then we have an illustrative list. It's not a complete total list, but it gives some examples for people who might be following along in statute.
So it's illustrative, that's a term of art.
Well, it's sort of like including but not limited to.
Okay.
So non-potentially hazardous baked goods. I dug into this a little bit more with the health department because we had some questions what this means. So your typical baked goods, cookies, and a pie would be included. But if it's something like a quiche or a cheesecake that has a dairy product that probably needs some refrigeration, that would be excluded under this definition. Candy, jams and jellies, dry herbs, trail mix, granola, cereal, mixed nuts, flavored vinegar, popcorn, coffee beans, dry tea. Here are the pickles. Home canned pickles, vegetables or fruits having an equilibrium pH value of 4.6 or lower, or a water activity value of 0.85 or less, that are made using recipes that are either approved by the National Center for Home Food Preservation or reviewed by a food processing authority for safety, and any other good that is defined by the commissioner and ruler policy. So that's the catch-all. That there could be other items that are on this list, but this is just the for example list of what would be captured under this category. So that is the new category that's being created. I'm going to skip ahead because we just have renumbering on these pages. That brings us to Section 3, which is an existing section in statute in Title 18, the health title, about the commissioner's rule-making authority under the chapter on food and lodging entities. So one thing that's being added to the commissioner's rule-making authority is that there would be a training requirement for food manufacturing establishment operators and employees to ensure cleanliness, sanitation, and healthfulness. The department can tell you a little bit more about this, but the testimony that the committee downstairs heard was that this isn't like necessarily an in-person training. This could be an electronic training that a food producer, home food producer takes from their house.
When we put a sentence like this into statute, there shall be training requirements
Mhm.
in that sort of passive.
Yeah.
voice, who's going to come up with the requirements?
So this is all under the commissioner's rulemaking.
Okay, so it's all
So
explained.
this is, yeah,
Okay.
there's a whole list. These ellipses indicate that there's a whole list that's being omitted.
Yeah.
So this is a list of everything that the health department is required to put into rule, and this item is being added to that list, that there shall be training requirements for food manufacturing operators.
Okay, good. So I see when you, if you go back up to the bottom of the previous page there,
Oh.
that sentence sort of answered my question.
Okay,
Commissioner shall adopt rules.
okay.
Thank you.
No problem. Section 4, this is a section you should be familiar with because you worked on this quite a bit when you had the bill in front of you. This is the fees section. And if you remember, we had the subdivision 3, food manufacturing establishments, was broken down into subcategories. On line 19, we have the non-bakeries. And then on page 7, line 3, you have bakeries. And those are the two sections that left this committee. There was no third category that was created. So under existing law, non-bakeries, on the top of page 7, if there are gross receipts of $10,000 or less, they're exempt pursuant to section 4358. So that's existing law, and the Senate chose to maintain the status quo with regard to non-bakery products. With regard to food manufacturing establishments that are listed as bakeries, you'll notice that we don't have this same language about the exemption here. That is because most of the bakery products are going to be captured under the cottage food product definition. So most of them will be captured under this subdivision C on line 7, which is the new category, cottage food operations. Gross receipts of $30,000 or less from the sale of cottage food products are exempt pursuant to 4358. If it's a cottage food product, the threshold is $30,000. If you're producing less than $30,000 at home, no license, no licensing fee. Okay.
Can I just ask something about that?
Yeah, Representative Boston.
So in the past, if somebody was going to sell something from a cottage industry, say at a farmer's market, they were supposed to register with the Secretary of State office. You're saying now that that does not
The
need to happen.
registration hasn't changed.
So what did you just say?
There's no license or licensure fee, but you still have to submit a filing form with the health department.
Okay, so nothing will be issued as a final product except like maybe a receipt that says that you registered.
I don't know how the department would operationalize that, if they would issue a receipt or not.
Okay. But the only thing that somebody would need to do, they do need to contact the Secretary of State's office to register, whatever that means.
If they're planning to sell food, and they're underneath the threshold that would require a license, there's still the requirement to file with the department.
So, and that's still, so that's existing statute.
That's existing, and this draft maintains that, with some clarifying language.
So can we just pause for a minute here and make sure that we understand A, B, and C? So C, food manufacturing establishments, cottage food operations. We may need to go back to the definitions, but so that group, that category, if you're selling less than $30,000 a year, you're exempt.
Mm.
And can we just review who's in that category? Who are
Yeah.
food manufacturing establishments, cottage food operations?
So go back up to our definition. I think this 6th definition is the easiest. So, well, it's helpful. So a cottage food operator, again, person producing at home in their home kitchen or a kitchen on the person's personal property.
Okay,
And this is what they could be producing, something that does not require refrigeration or time or temperature control for safety. Those are the cottage food products. And then this list is the examples.
so baked goods that are not potentially hazardous.
Mhm.
I don't know whether that means most baked goods or all baked goods. Maybe the health department can help us with that.
They can.
Yeah.
My understanding from the health department, and they'll certainly correct me if I'm wrong, is that this would cover most baked goods, but the ones that, something that has to be refrigerated, like a quiche or like the cheesecake, that is not going to be captured here.
Okay, good. So, all right, so good. So all of that list, which we went through, that's going to be, we can think of that as, that's where you've got the exemption, the under 30,000 exemption. Representative.
So up in the Great Northeast Kingdom, we have a growing cottage food industry. It's the Amish. And their donuts are famous. And they're baked goods.
Mhm.
So if they're, as long as they're below 30,000, they fall under all this.
I'm assuming that a donut would be captured under this, but I would defer to the department
Okay.
to answer that question.
Yeah, you're correct, Katie. Yes.
Yep.
Mhm.
So Katie, I think go back if you wouldn't mind to where you left off there on page 7.
Sure.
And so focusing on C,
Mhm.
but before you move on, can we just review again what A and B are?
Sure.
They're two different categories that are not,
Yes.
it's not exempt.
Yes. There are exemptions. So to compare and contrast your version to this version, this category, non-bakeries, you had it, or the house had it, that if the non-bakery product was produced in a home kitchen and it was $30,000 or less of gross sales, that it was exempt. This version has that gross receipts of 10,000 or less are exempt. So 10,000. Now, there are possibilities where there might be some non-bakery products that are also cottage food products. So potentially there might be some non-bakery products that fall into the category of a cottage food product, and then they would have the $30,000 exemption applied to them. Maybe like the vinegar that's on the list of the cottage food products.
So I think what might be helpful for us to understand is what would fall into A that's not it would not qualify for the cottage food exemption.
I mean, I'm assuming that the list is probably pretty large, and I'll leave it to the department, but to do the reverse of what you just asked, like the candy, dry herbs, mixed nuts, flavored vinegar, popcorn, coffee beans, dry tea, pickles, all of that is going to be a non-bakery product. So potentially, an item could fall into the $30,000 exemption as a cottage food product instead of the $10,000 exemption if it falls outside the list of cottage food products.
Representative Burt, session.
I'll come back to it.
All right, so then that was sort of, we'll come back to Representative Burt's question. I think we want to just, we can move on with you, Katie, and then if you want to come back and better understand it, what are we talking about in A? And then in B, and then B, these are bakeries.
These are bakeries, so we have no exemption language here because most of the bakery products are going to fall into the cottage food operation category. And that has the exemption for $30,000.
So right now, this is existing law essentially.
Mhm.
And thinking about the quiche, I'll run with that example. So the quiche is not cottage food that's going to be qualifying for C. So it might be B. It might be somebody's home bakery.
Mhm. So, yep, be one, or, the home bakery on line 4 is gonna capture, a home baker that's making more than $30,000 in gross receipts a year. Or products that are falling outside of the cottage food, product definition.
Okay. And with the home baker who's selling quiche, $9,000 worth of quiche a year,
Mhm.
are they having to get a license? And
Mhm.
they are, okay. So they're not exempt to being under 10,000 at all. Okay. Okay.
Okay. This language in section 5, well, amendments to 4358 were also in your bill, but this has been updated since you've last seen it. So first we have language that the obligation to obtain a license and the associated licensure fees in this subchapter shall not apply to a cottage food operation or other food manufacturing establishment that is exempt due to its average gross retail sales being below the listed thresholds in 4353 of this title. So what that says is if you don't qualify for an exemption under the fees section that we just went over, then you have to get a license and pay the licensure fee. And then subsection C, the existing laws we already talked about is that there's this obligation to register with the department. So the language in existing laws provide documentation to the department. So this language has been updated to call the documentation a licensing exemption filing. So it has a name now. And also we're cross-referencing that training requirement that says as part of submitting your filing, you're providing an attestation that you've done the training. So this reads, annually, a food manufacturing establishment claiming a licensing exemption pursuant to this title shall submit to the department a licensing exemption filing as required by rule. The licensing exemption filing shall require the food manufacturing establishment to attest to the completion of any training required by rule pursuant to section 4303 of this title. So that's cross-referencing back to the rulemaking section.
Really, Nelson?
Yeah, thank you. So that's just to ensure that the Department of Health knows who's doing what where.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then
Can I just ask a question? So with the training, like, is there something ready? Like if we pass this and then on July 1st, there's going to be a training ready? Or how will that work for people that like would want to work at a farmer's market this summer under the new rules?
I think you should,
Ask the health.
direct that to the health department. The next section is a rulemaking section. As you'll see, the effective date for this is July 1/25. And as I know, this committee knows the rulemaking process can take 9 months to a year. And so there was some concern, there was conversation in the committee downstairs that they wanted these exemptions to apply to the farmers markets as soon as possible. So folks could start taking advantage of these exemptions sooner rather than later. And so what this language does is it says that while the permanent rules are in process, that this language authorizes or directs the health department to pursue emergency rules so that they can have rules in effect as soon as possible that could apply to this particular summer and the farmers markets this summer. And that this language deems to have met the emergency rulemaking standard that's currently in statute.
Representative Burke.
Chair, what is the current statute have for a threshold on food manufacturing?
For non-bakeries, it's 10,000, and for bakery products produced in a home kitchen, it's 6,500 a year.
So essentially, with this version of the bill, we wouldn't be increasing the threshold for non-bakeries.
Correct, but you also wouldn't have that 6,500 anymore either.
Yeah. But
Yeah.
I just.
So specifically for bakeries, yes, there wouldn't be a specific exemption. Again, most bakery products are going to be captured under the cottage food product definition, so they'll be subject to the 30,000. But to the extent somebody is producing products that aren't fitting in, or hazardous bakery products, then yes, there's. I know that was the wrong way to say that, wasn't it?
Watch out for that
They don't
cage.
follow the definition that require refrigeration or heat sensitive, or then they would be outside the cottage food definition and they would need a license.
And, but we would be asking those food manufacturing non-bakeries to go through further training than than current statute.
Right now, it's requiring that all food establishments, that there would be some type of training requirement in rule. And I'm not sure if the department is already doing that. I forget, I've lost track if there's already a training requirement and this just codifies it.
Would it be helpful to jump in?
Please.
Okay, thanks. Elizabeth Worsing from the Health Department. So there are training requirements for the licensed manufactured food producers. One option that may help with your question, Representative Burt, is the status quo category of the food manufacturing establishments under $10,000 exemption will still be there. So things that don't meet the definition of a cottage food product, may be able to fit into this category. So, something like a quiche, we wouldn't necessarily consider a baked good because of what Katie mentioned. It has requirements for temperature control, but there may be the option to essentially fit it into that $10,000 exemption category, depending on how people are producing things. So in some ways, the way we've been looking at this, the existing status quo exemption of under $10,000 without many limitations will still exist. So for the sauerkraut example, that where if you're not interested in getting a process authority review or using a standardized recipe, that could be done under the $10,000 exemption. The quiche could be done under the $10,000 exemption. And then for expanding based on risk to an additional $30,000 of cottage food products, that's where some of the, similar to other states, the limitations by risk and definitions of what a cottage food product would be. In addition, you could do an additional $30,000 of pickling, for example, just using standardized recipes or having those products reviewed by a process authority, which is either it's consistent with what other states required and it's actually beyond what a lot of other states allow in terms of acidifying food or fermenting food in a cottage food home operation under an exemption. So I don't know if that helps a little bit with your questions.
Yes, thank you very much. I know Katie needs to be in another place at the same time. So before we let you go, I just wanted to see if there were any other questions for you, Katie. And I just had one. Is there anybody who is any food producer who is, I'm going to say rendered worse off, but has additional requirements other than the training, which we can talk about a little bit, but in terms of what they would have to pay or requirements, anybody who's getting something now that they won't get in the future?
I don't think so. All that I'm thinking is the current home bakers have that 65 cap that they don't need to get a license under. That's going away. Most will be subject to the 30,000. And what the health department just said is even if they're not under the 30,000 cap, many of them can come under the $10,000 cap. So I don't know if there would be any products that would fall through the gap there. The health department would be better equipped to answer that question than me, but that's the only potential gap I could see.
Okay.
I agree with Katie. I think we're maintaining some of the status quo exemptions for that exact consideration to not, have this detrimentally affect anyone. The overall goal, it will definitely increase the threshold for many, many producers.
Right. Katie, thank you for stopping in.
You're welcome.
If we have more questions about the language or if there's any interest in amending it all, we'll reach out.
Okay, sounds great.
So, Elizabeth, if you, we're going to turn it over to you now. And if you wanted, we may have more questions, but if you wanted to say anything first about the process up to now, you've been listening in. So I think, we've already heard, and I think for all of us, who weren't necessarily tracking what was going on in the Senate, we're just sort of coming up to speed.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting us back. It's great to see you all again. And we're very supportive of the version that passed out of the Senate and worked very closely with the committees and the stakeholders to land in a place that meets their interests and also includes some public health protections. And I kind of mentioned some of the additions in this framework are consistent with requirements of cottage food laws in other states. We took a close look at especially the regional laws and some other states that you may be of interest. The laws primarily really limit what types of foods are exempt from licensing based on food safety risk, as well as might require some operators to complete a very basic training, which we've worked in, and have a filing process, which is already part of the department's framework, and include labeling of food made in a home kitchen to the representative's question. So that is already a requirement as well. But this bill will expand the current existing exemptions from licensing and licensing fees to help support those small producers by allowing them to make an increased $30,000 of annual sales in cottage food products, as was outlined. And in addition, the existing $10,000 food product, processed food product exemption other than cottage foods will remain in this statute as it has. So put together, one way to look at this is that there could be a total of $40,000 annual gross sales of processed food product exemptions for some types of operators based on what they're making, which is beyond, the adjustments that you all were discussing based on potential adjustments for inflation. So we think this might be a great compromise to help the stakeholders with what they were interested in doing and also include some of the public health protections. We have provided a lot of testimony that is available if you do want to review it. We provided written testimony, so that is available. And then there was a good question about the training. So we have heard loud and clear that there's interest in getting this off and running as soon as possible, depending on what passes. And so what we'd suggest, we're available, the health department, to create a very basic, free, easy training that essentially producers could review on their own time. There's an example from Minnesota that we've shared that is essentially a PowerPoint of information, and a lot of the benefit is it outlines what is allowed under the law, which would help clarify some of the misinformation or understanding of producers also. So the training in our minds would include what's allowed under the law and some basic food safety information and public health and sanitation information for producing food in a home kitchen. So we have some great examples we can work from. We're expecting to create something very quickly if a legislation is passed and make it available for free that producers could take on their own time, essentially. And as part of how the language is written in this, what passed in the Senate, the producer, when they do their annual filing, would just attest that they essentially reviewed that training. So we're trying to make this as simple as possible for producers to just gain some additional information that will help them produce safe products. And I'm happy to just stop there and see what other questions you might have that we could try to help answer.
While we're thinking about our questions, Elizabeth, you mentioned you had written testimony that you'd shared with other committees. Could I ask you to send that to, our committee assistant has left for the season. So I think if you send it to me, I can make sure that it gets posted.
Okay, great. I think Jessica might be in the room and I'm sure she can do that quickly.
And Jessica, if you could send it, if you actually are able to send it to Megan Canella, I don't know that she's in your list, but that's where I would send it. So Representative Bosland has a question.
Yeah, I have a question. I'm not positive that it landed in the bill, but I recall when we took testimony on this before we passed it out of our committee, there was I guess he would have been classified as a cottage producer who made something like trail mix or Chex Mix or something to that effect. And he was concerned that there was a pretty cumbersome labeling requirement that he had to put on every package that showed all the items that were in his food, along with a message that said something like, this was made in a home kitchen that hasn't been inspected, and there was very specific language. Is there any change in the labeling, or is that still going to be required of all cottage producers, that everything be labeled with all the ingredients and the that warning label?
Yeah, thank you for that question. So the labeling requirements are separate. They are in the manufactured food rule, and they are labeling of ingredients and allergens is a national requirement. It's consistent with what other states would require as well, to provide the ingredient list for the consumer. So to the other representative's question here, you would need to list all the ingredients in the product. So if you are assembling a product that is made from many other processed food products, it is possible that the list would be pretty long. But those requirements are still in place. They're not affected by this statutory proposal, and they are it's a standard requirement for labeling packaged processed food products. So that will remain.
So how does that work? Like if somebody's selling cookies at a farmer's market, can they just have a sheet if somebody asks and say, oh, this is the list of ingredients? Or are they supposed to literally hand each person a card that has the list of ingredients in the chocolate chip cookie or something? Because I've been to a lot of farmers markets and I've never seen a baked good with an ingredient list that comes with it. I mean, is that what's expected, or is it just needs to be available?
Yeah, good question. So if they're packaging the cookies, in a container, the container needs to be labeled. At a farmer's market, if they're handing them out, per order, you can have a sign. You can have a label on the table that identifies what the ingredients and the allergens are. Mm-hmm.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Representative Burke.
And also the warning label is still required. Is that correct?
Yes, thanks for that question. That is in rule, and that is still required to give consumers information. So that is really kind of the only identifier for folks that the product they're purchasing is made by an exempt operator, right? So in a lot of states reviewing cottage food laws, other states really restrict where these types of exempt producers can sell products, meaning only directly to consumers, for example, or only in that state. And we in Vermont do not restrict on those types of criteria. So this information is important just to give consumers information so that they can make a risk-based choice in purchasing products.
And I guess I was under the impression that in interstate sales put you in a different category, at least within the bakeries category. Is that correct? So you would need a license if you were doing sales, say in New Hampshire as well.
Right. And maybe perhaps you're thinking of if producers are selling products in interstate commerce, the Federal Food and Drug Administration also has jurisdiction over products in interstate commerce. So there are potentially additional registration and regulatory requirements for that type of activity. Our Vermont statute is unlike other states where we do not restrict where these products can be sold. And in some ways that can be helpful to people, Vermonters that are on the border, right, with New Hampshire and going to farmers markets in New Hampshire, things like that. But yeah, it's definitely a consideration for food producers is interstate commerce may bring in federal jurisdiction.
I just have a couple more questions, if that's good. New York State, I know that they have a list of products that fall under the cottage law category.
Yeah.
Similar to what we have in this bill in front of us now. What is the threshold for income for those food manufacturers that do cottage food in New York? What's their income threshold?
Yeah, thanks. Good question. I think so. Looking at New York State, They did not have an income threshold, but they did. Let me just pull that up really quickly. Sorry. So New York, they did not have a gross sales limit, but they did limit cottage food to sales only in New York. And they also limit the products to low risk foods that do not require temperature control for safety. So a similar list of baked goods, herbs, candy, granola, popcorn, pretzels, and they prohibit canning. So no low acid or acidified food canning products as part of that cottage food allowance.
And so, and do you know if they have a separate category for those types of, canned products? Do they
Yeah.
have, I'm assuming they have a different category for those, and do you know what the threshold is on those?
Right. So you would have to operate out of a commercial facility and be licensed, similar to, we have that as well for being a commercial food processor.
So they
Yeah,
don't
so-
have an exemption for,
Correct.
okay,
In the home, you can't do that in the home in New York. And they similarly have a label requirement with
Yeah.
similar criteria. Yep. Mhm.
thanks.
You're welcome.
Can we, all set?
Yeah, thanks.
Can we talk a little bit more about that category of home canned products and how I'm thinking about in general, the way we do things now, what's allowed now versus what would be allowed going forward. So I had asked earlier whether there was anybody who was currently permitted to do something without a license or without having to pay a licensure fee who now would be. And I just want to be sure, because this is a little confusing about what we're doing with the pickles or anything that's home canned that falls into this low pH range.
Yes, good question. So the $10,000 food processor exemption status quo would still exist. So if you wanted to do just a small amount of pickles, let's say a couple $1,000s of pickles, and don't want to go through the requirements of cottage food producer in order to sell up to $30,000 of those approved products, you could still do that under the $10,000 exemption. So nothing would change. There's still no license fee. You just need to continue filing a exemption form with the health department. If you would like to do a larger amount of products like pickles that would meet the pH and water activity requirements, and those are essentially just standards for a safely canned pickle. You could either use free recipes from the National Center for Home Food Preservation website. So they've already been validated by a food safety authority or process authority, and they're just recipes that you can follow for free. And it includes pickles, it includes some fermented products as well. That's available. Alternatively, if you have the special grandma's recipe that we keep hearing about, that could be just evaluated by a process authority in the region for safety. And that would also just confirm that it meets ingredient and processing steps that will produce a safe product if followed. And we have a couple process authorities in the region and more nationally, and a process review typically in the ones in our region typically costs between $150 and $190 to have a product reviewed. And then you'll know that formulation will be safe moving forward and can continue to be used. So that's a standard food safety resource and requirement that exists now. And essentially we're just similar to other states that do allow canning in a home. We're requesting that be part of the process as well to ensure safety for the public.
So a review, the language is reviewed by a food processing authority for safety. That's not a service that the state offers. It would be a private authority.
Yeah, it's done by academic institutions. So in our region, University of Maine does a lot of these, also Cornell University. We also have some process authorities in Vermont that are private consultants, but it's people that have um, uh, training in thermal processing for acidification or low acid canned foods. So it's usually a microbiology PhD, for example, at an academic university. So this is a resource that exists out there currently.
Representative Burt?
The, so in statute currently, for food manufacturers, non-bakeries, those food manufacturers, are they allowed to produce up to $10,000, in current statute of things like kimchi or sauerkraut that have to be refrigerated? Is that
Yeah.
correct?
That is correct because there has not been kind of any clarifying language otherwise. So yes, that is in practice what is happening.
So essentially there might be some small changes to fees. I'm not sure. I'd have to look at that, but in terms of the basics, such as, the $10,000 limit and the types of products that a food manufacturing non-bakery facility could produce in the home kitchen, that's basically remaining the same. Is that
It
what you're saying?
does.
Okay.
It does, yes, to respect that landscape that has existed for many years in Vermont. Yeah, we did not want to restrict folks that are currently doing something on a very small scale.
And I know when you testified a while back when the
Mhm.
bill was coming through our committee, you mentioned that there was, I don't remember the number, but a certain number of cases of foodborne illness that you were aware of in the state.
Yeah.
I believe it was for last year. I mean, it was in the 7. I don't know. Do you have that number available?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So we can also share with you, because this question, came up in the Senate Ag Committee Senate Health and Welfare Committee as well. So we did put together a summary that outlines the process of reportable illness, foodborne illness to the health department, how cases are detected, how the department investigates every case, and the total number in 2024 of foodborne reportable diseases to the health department. So in total, we have talked with you previously about the 4 listeriosis cases and the 110 salmonellosis cases in 2024. With all the pathogens that are reported to the health department for foodborne illness, there were 474 cases of foodborne illness in 2024. But the summary we also provided included some of the mortality and hospitalization rates were of interest to the Senate Health and Welfare Committee. So we did share with them that nationally, illness from listeria has a hospitalization rate of about 94%. So 94% of cases of listeria nationally are usually hospitalized, and an estimated death rate of about 15% nationally. Similarly, illness from Clostridium botulinum, which would be the botulism illness, has a hospitalization rate of 82% and an estimated death rate of 17%. So data for Vermont over the last 10 years. So from January 2015 to April 2025, we in Vermont had 38 listeriosis cases that were reported to the health department, and 4 people died. During the same period in Vermont, there were 202 reported hospitalizations of people with salmonellosis, 64 hospitalizations of people with STEC, which is Shiga toxin producing E. coli, and 241 hospitalizations of people with Campylobacteriosis, and 6 people with salmonellosis or Campylobacteriosis infections died. We talked a lot with the committee about how cases can look sporadic, and I think we spoke with you all about that too. So everyone with reportable foodborne illness is interviewed to identify possible exposure sources. People do often report eating food from farmers markets or from neighbors, friends, or colleagues, but unless multiple cases are reported and all mention a similar exposure, it's difficult to pinpoint the cause for each of these individual infections. But we shared with you those 4 outbreak investigations from unregulated and unlicensed operators and events that have been investigated from things like community dinners, and agritourism served meal, and a homemade dinner. So we do have that summary that we're happy to, if you'd like to peruse more. But there's foodborne illness in Vermont, and situations are routinely investigated. The main point we wanted to share with Senate Health and Welfare was that foodborne illness is widely underreported. And we know the actual number of cases are much higher than what is captured in the reportable disease system. And while most cases may be mild, some individuals can become very sick and die from infections.
And based on that, you mentioned cases you investigated. Are there any where you can, show data from food manufacturing, non-bakery home kitchens, or from home kitchen bakeries that you investigated or that you could pinpoint?
We had those 4 outbreaks associated with unlicensed operators, so a more broad category, right? But I think the answer to your question is really we have not detected that at this stage, but it does require people seeking out medical care, right? Getting tested for a foodborne illness, having a confirmed pathogen, and then the interviews identifying that people shared a common cottage food product, right? So it requires a lot of steps along the way to happen to identify and kind of detect that. And I think our message would be there's a lot of sporadic foodborne illness out there. Kind of detecting that exact scenario has not come up this year, but I think the main message is any foodborne illness is preventable, and food safety, requirements exist so that we can all prevent illness from happening.
Agreed. Yeah, I just want to, I'm just trying to strictly understand the data, and yeah, if you could send that along, that'd be great. I
Sure.
guess my main thing is just trying to understand, the raw data. In your opinion, are food manufacturing, non-bakeries, or in a home kitchen, or home kitchen bakeries a higher risk than, say, a restaurant or another, the establishments that you do license and inspect? Is there data that actually confirms that they're a higher risk?
Very supportive
have?
in this bill of increasing the threshold for home bakeries, because bakery products are low risk by nature, right, for food safety. And the provisions in this bill would include some of those public health considerations to ensure that the canned products are also not creating an additional risk. So I think some of the public health considerations built into this bill are something the health department can support to ensure food safety, to kind of prevent foodborne illness cases moving forward.
So essentially, you don't have data available to suggest whether or not they pose a higher risk or not.
Baked goods are pretty low risk, so they don't require temperature control, right? And for safety, and they're shelf stable, so that's why they're included here in the cottage food allowances. And then for canning, we just need it to be done safely, right, to prevent things like botulism and other salmonella or listeria issues from happening.
Appreciate it.
Elizabeth, your audio was being cut off at the beginning of the last couple of responses. I would just say if the department does have any data that breaks out, to the extent that you have the information, not just last year, but over any period of time, that breaks out by sector, where you're able to identify or point to, here's where it originated, home bakery versus non-regulated, non-licensed versus licensed, however you categorize it. That would be helpful to have if you have anything like that you want to send along.
We have the summary that we provided, which I think we definitely can share with you. Thank
Thank
you.
you. So other questions? I was just wondering if you could give us a quick overview about how in the state, the department or other local authorities actually go about enforcing regulations. So if there's a farmer's market in Montpelier on Saturday, does somebody from the state or somebody else possibly walk through and see whether there's an ingredient list next to the cookies, or do some temp checking if there's, I don't know whether they're allowed to have food, warm food, for example.
Yeah, thanks for that question. So the health department and the Agency of Agriculture are the two food safety agencies in our state. There aren't local authorities. So the health department does have the licensing and regulatory requirements for prepared food vendors, so retail food service, and also, as you all have been talking about, the manufactured food producers. With the exception, as you all know very well, the Agency of Agriculture is our sister agency that regulates dairy, meat, provides support for maple, and has a produce safety regulatory program. So throughout the summer, we do work closely with event coordinators, so the farmers market managers, to submit a list of all the vendors that are attending either their farmers market, or we also inspect fairs and festivals throughout the state all year. And we ensure that, vendors are properly licensed if the licensing requirements apply. So this filing for exempt producers comes in handy in just coming across vendors out at events to make sure that they're aware of the requirements, they've filed an exemption, or we can speak with them about making sure they're aware they should. But we do attend the events throughout the summer season, especially to verify that folks have the equipment required for operating at a farmer's market or a festival, that they're properly licensed, and that they're storing and serving food safely to the public. So that is a regular occasion, and we work a lot with the market managers, the event coordinators, and folks putting on events. At this stage, compliance is good because folks know what's required. We try to provide as much education as possible. We may have vendors that come from out of state, and are required to be licensed here as well. So that is definitely, that season is kicking up right now, and becomes very busy with events across the state. So thanks for that question.
Do you also monitor private events, weddings? I don't know how you would know about somebody's wedding, but is that ever a thing?
There is a licensing category for commercial caterers, and those are usually the businesses that are catering weddings. So they are licensed and are routinely inspected to make sure that they are following equipment and food safety requirements. But we don't usually show up at somebody's wedding, if that's your question.
Good.
I don't think that would be welcome.
Representative Burke.
Thank you. So in looking at this bill, and I guess it would also pertain to current statute, but if you are above the threshold and you do have to get a license and pay for that, does that mean that you are, well, I would assume it obviously means that you would be, you'd have to be inspected at that point. But would that also mean that you have to have a commercial kitchen in order to operate at that once you're past the threshold?
Yeah, most of the licensing categories, the regulatory requirements include, yeah, a separate commercial space that's licensed. Yes. We do have, I don't know if this applies to your question, but we do have some folks that are, mainly licensed as a bakery or a restaurant, and that's their primary business, but they do want to do a little bit of food processing on the side, and they do file in for the exemption for those types of activities. So it's possible to do a combination of things. As you know, Vermont producers are very diversified, so there is a way to kind of address people's different production interests and needs through the various licensing categories or exemption categories, if that's helpful. But this cottage food, the exemptions is typically how very small producers might start out and test the waters. We have a lot of people that file with us, file an exemption form, and then, kind of decide they're not going to do that anymore. And others, the success story is usually when people start out very small like that and grow, and then eventually, they outgrow their home kitchen. They move into a commercial space, and really their business expands and takes off from there. So it's a great way for folks to start out. And nationally, cottage food really is thought of as a real small scale home food producer exemption.
All right. Anybody else have any questions about the bill or anything for our guest, Representative Lipsky?
Well, my question for Elizabeth, I don't want to violate committee decorum, but I'm curious about the ridge that's behind you. Is that the ski hills? Is that Sugar Bush or Mount Ellen, or is that Killington? Or where are you?
Goodness, that is a great question and totally out of
It's-
season for May now, right? It is a standard state of Vermont background, and I will have to look into that. But yes, good eye. I'm sure some of you might identify it more than me, right?
I could identify it as down to about 2 areas. I'll leave it. Thank you, Chairman, for indulging my.
I have to say, I was trying to figure it out myself, so.
I was too.
It's not a chemo or Stratton.
Well, I thought they're, but Chemo and Stratton are too far away. And
Yeah, either way, it's out of season for May, right?
I think it's Mount Ellen and Mad River.
All right, any other questions about the bill?
No.
Good, well, thank you then for joining us. We'll reach out if anything else comes up.
Okay, and thank you so much for your interest and engagement in this topic. I think we know there are many interested stakeholders, and we tried very hard to find a good compromise that would meet everyone's needs. So thank you so much for taking this.
Well, we appreciate that.
Thank you.
The only other agenda item this morning, I think, is when Representative O'Brien is here, just to reconvene briefly. I'm not sure when that will be exactly. So why don't we go off the air, and if folks can not go too far, or at least check back in sometime before